Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back in time, past the loud centuries full of gunpowder, revolutions, and powdered wigs, and slide into the dusty, candlelit corners of ancient law codes. Now, I know what you're thinking. Laws are boring. And yes, that's the point. They're boring, rigid, and occasionally written by men who thought washing your hands after touching a dead body was optional, but fining you for sneezing at the wrong festival was mandatory. That's the exact level of human absurdity we're after tonight. So, get cozy. Dim the lights. Pretend you've just been handed a clay tablet fresh from Mesopotamia, still warm from the scribe's hand. And let's read through the greatest hits of ancient legislation, where kings, priests, and lawmakers thought they were building order and justice, but really they were just leaving us with bedtime stories of rules so oddly specific they can only have been inspired by one very embarrassing personal incident. And the best part? Some of these strange laws have survived in one form or another. Thousands of years later, we're still quietly living under the echoes of Hammurabi's insomnia-driven drafting sessions. So, let's begin in Babylon, because where else would you start when looking for weird laws other than the civilization that literally wrote them in stone? Hammurabi's "everything is fine until it isn't" laws. King Hammurabi ruled Babylon around 1750 BCE, and he is best remembered for his famous Code of Hammurabi, a set of about 280 laws carved into a massive black stone pillar. On the surface, it looks like the dawn of civilization, rules about theft, property, trade, and family. But once you read past the "don't murder people" basics, you start to notice something. Hammurabi had a very particular sense of problem solving. For example, let's say you're a builder. You put up a house and the roof collapses, killing the homeowner. In our modern world, you'd get sued, maybe lose your license, insurance premiums go up. In Hammurabi's Babylon, the punishment was straightforward. They killed you. Yes, liability insurance was just being dead. And if the collapse killed the homeowner's son, then your son got executed, because why not double down on generational trauma? It's the ancient equivalent of, "Oh, you broke my iPhone? Cool, I'll just smash your kid's Xbox." Logical, fair, completely insane. But here's the fun part. The Hammurabi mindset has not fully left us. In modern legal systems, we still carry fragments of his laws, like an eye for an eye principles in some interpretations of justice. Of course, these days you can't just execute your neighbor's kid for bad masonry, though depending on where you live, building codes still feel like a slow-motion death penalty for contractors. Ancient Egypt. No, you can't fish that way. If Babylon was about death penalties for bad craftsmanship, Egypt was about maintaining cosmic balance. Their laws were tied to Ma'at, the concept of divine order. But every so often they snuck in laws that make you wonder what happened one particularly weird Tuesday on the Nile. Take fishing, for instance. Some Egyptian laws banned certain fishing methods, like using nets in sacred parts of the river. And sure, it sounds like basic conservation. But the reality? Those areas were reserved for the temple priests, because nothing screams divine order than, "Sorry, peasants, only I can eat catfish from this bend in the river." And the Egyptians also had very particular inheritance laws. If you were a daughter, congratulations, you often had more legal rights to property than your brother. Which sounds progressive until you remember this was also a culture that legally considered your entire existence secondary to whether or not you could maintain the family tomb rituals. Basically, women could inherit wealth, but only so the gods wouldn't haunt everyone for eternity. What's left today? Well, inheritance law everywhere still carries traces of ancient ideas about property continuity, and priests still sometimes get the best seat at the buffet table. Egypt would be proud. Greece. Drunken philosophy with legal consequences. Moving west, let's stop in ancient Greece. Democracy. Philosophy. Men in robes arguing about shadows on cave walls. And laws, some of which are still floating in our world today, like ghosts with wine breath. One of the strangest Greek laws came from Sparta. Now, Spartans are famous for their obsession with military discipline. But did you know they actually made it illegal to be a coward? Yes, cowardice was punishable under Spartan law. Imagine your modern HR department trying to implement that. Steve, from accounting, you look nervous at the fire drill, so, exile. On the Athenian side, there was a law that if you didn't take a side during civil disputes, if you stayed neutral, you could lose your citizenship. Democracy was nice, but apparently apathy was a crime, which means half of Twitter would be stateless by now. And alcohol? Oh, Athens had opinions. Certain festivals banned women from drinking wine. The fear was that if women had too much Dionysian spirit, the city would collapse in orgiastic chaos, which is ironic considering that orgiastic chaos was already Tuesday night for half the philosophers. Do we see this today? Kind of. Laws against draft dodging echo Spartan cowardice bans, and social systems everywhere still punish apathy in subtle ways. Voting, taxes, jury duty. Athens is alive every time you get a scary government letter in the mail. Rome. You call that a law? Empire. Of course, Rome, the empire of endless laws, most of which were copied from the Greeks, mashed with local traditions, and then inflated until lawyers had jobs for centuries. Roman law was full of practical innovations, contracts, property rights, citizenship rights, but it also had some gems of weirdness. For example, under early Roman law, a father had absolute power over his family. Known as patria potesta, it meant dad could legally sell his children into slavery. 3 times! Because apparently after the 3rd time, the universe decided, okay, he's not coming back. That's just abandonment. And then there was the Lex Julia de Adulteries. Essentially, if you caught your wife cheating, you were legally allowed to kill her lover, but only if he was of lower social rank. If he was elite, you couldn't touch him, because Rome cared more about class than your heartbreak. So basically, you can stab the baker, but not the senator. And Romans had laws about luxury too, called sumptuary laws. They tried to regulate how much you could spend on banquets, clothes, or funerals. Imagine a cop raiding your dinner party because you served too much imported fish. It was the ancient version of eat the rich, except the rich wrote the laws and ignored them anyway. And yes, the echoes remain. Modern family law, property rights, even the idea of a legal contract, they all come from Rome. Sadly, the 3 strikes and your kid isn't your kid anymore law did not survive, though some parents of teenagers might wish it had. India, laws of the cosmic bureaucracy. Sliding east, let's land in ancient India, where the laws of Manu were compiled, one of the oldest and most influential sets of rules for social and moral order. These were less about don't steal bread and more about codifying the entire caste system into a legal framework. The rules covered everything: how you marry, how you eat, who you can sit next to, and even what kinds of jobs your children would inherit. Imagine the DMV, but eternal and cosmic. You were born into your social lane, and legally, you weren't allowed to switch highways. So one particularly odd leftover was the obsession with ritual purity. Some laws literally dictated which foods you could eat depending on your caste. Others went into microscopic detail about washing hands, clothes, and utensils after touching. Welcome back. Still awake? Probably. Or maybe you're already halfway gone, floating through the soft hum of medieval absurdities. Either way, tonight we're stepping off the stone tablets of the ancients and wandering into the candlelit, drafty halls of medieval Europe. This was the age of feudal lords, kings who thought washing was optional, and courts where lawyers tried their best to look wise while chickens stood trial. And yes, I do mean actual chickens. Because medieval law was less justice system and more Monty Python sketch someone accidentally took seriously. So tuck in a little tighter. Let's drift through some of the weirdest medieval laws, and of course, the ones that somehow stuck around. When animals needed lawyers. One of the most delightful and simultaneously tragic features of medieval law was its obsession with putting animals on trial. Yes, actual animals. If a pig killed a child, which unfortunately happened more often than you'd think, local courts would hold a full criminal trial for the pig. Witnesses testified, lawyers argued, judges deliberated. And the pig? Usually dressed in little clothes for the occasion, because apparently humiliation was part of justice. Sometimes pigs were hanged, sometimes burned. Occasionally, if the pig seemed less guilty, it was banished. Which makes you imagine a pig wandering through the forest, wearing a tiny cloak of shame, reflecting on its crimes. And it wasn't just pigs. Rats, locusts, weevils, and even termites got hauled into court. If insects infested a village, priests would issue formal excommunications. Yes, bugs could be excommunicated. The church would literally tell them, "Leave or God will smite you." Spoiler, God rarely smote. The bugs usually stayed. Now, as ridiculous as this sounds, there's a faint echo today. When we declare certain animals nuisance species and legally exterminate them, that's a quiet descendant of medieval vermin trials. Thankfully, though, modern courts don't require cockroaches to appear in person with legal representation. Yet. The law of bread. Bakers beware. Food laws were a medieval obsession, particularly when it came to bread. Bread was life. If your baker cheated you with short weight or bad flour, that wasn't just annoying, it was a crime against the entire community. In 13th century England, the assize of bread and ale became the first official food regulation in Europe. It dictated the exact size, weight, and price of bread loaves, adjusted weekly depending on grain prices. Bakers had to keep a little reference loaf called the assize loaf to prove compliance. If you cheated, punishments included fines, public humiliation, and in some cases the pillory, that wooden contraption where your head and hands stuck out while townsfolk pelted you with rotten vegetables, all for making bread too small. And here's the kicker. This law survived in some form for centuries. Even today, in many countries, food, weights, and measures laws are directly descended from this bread obsession. So the next time you complain that your bag of chips is half air, remember, you're participating in an 800-year-old European tradition of yelling at bakers. The sumptuary nonsense. If bread laws were about survival, sumptuary laws were about fashion policing. Medieval rulers loved regulating what people could wear, eat, or even furnish their houses with, because heaven forbid a peasant wear velvet. For example, in 1363, England passed a law stating that only the king, royal family, and dukes could wear cloth of gold or sable furs. Knights could wear silk, but only of certain value, and commoners, well, they were restricted to plain fabrics. Basically, dress codes enforced by law. The idea was to preserve the natural order of society, where you could identify someone's class just by looking at their sleeves. Because, apparently, nothing was scarier to medieval elites than a farmer wearing a nice hat. Did these laws work? Absolutely not. People ignored them constantly, but their existence tells you a lot about medieval anxieties. And, fun fact, sumptuary laws still pop up today in weird corners, like rules about official uniforms or bans on certain luxury imports. The ghost of medieval wardrobe anxiety is still alive in your closet.
Trial by ordeal. Let's burn our hands and see. Of course, no medieval law list is complete without trial by ordeal. This was the legal system's answer to, we don't know if you're guilty, so let's ask God to decide. The ordeals varied. One common version was the hot iron test. The accused had to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a few steps. Then their wounds were bandaged, and if they healed cleanly after 3 days, God had declared them innocent. If they festered, guilty. Because festering meant they were rejected by the pure element of water, which is darkly ironic since most innocent people drowned. Thankfully, trial by ordeal was eventually banned by the Church in the 13th century. But the underlying mindset that divine or supernatural forces could judge human guilt still echoes in modern superstition. Anytime someone says, "the truth will come out," you're hearing a faint medieval whisper of ordeal logic. Beard laws. Because why not? Yes, beards. Medieval and early modern rulers occasionally got very specific about facial hair. Take Russia. In 1698, Tsar Peter the Great, technically early modern but still in the spirit, introduced a beard tax. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay for a special token proving you'd paid your beard dues. If not, your beard could be forcibly shaved in public. Why? Because Peter wanted Russia to look more modern and European. And nothing said modern than bare chins. The beard tax became both a revenue scheme and a national humiliation ritual. Even earlier, in parts of medieval Europe, monks and priests faced strict beard rules. Some orders demanded shaving, others required growing one. Because apparently, God cared deeply about your grooming habits. Do traces survive? Oh yes. Beards still occasionally cause workplace controversies, school rules, and even military regulations. Somewhere out there, Peter the Great is smiling smugly at every modern dress code memo. Laws against fun. Dancing, singing, and frogs. Medieval Europe also had a habit of banning fun. If you enjoyed yourself too much, someone somewhere was ready to outlaw it. In 15th century France, certain towns banned dancing on Sundays. Singing bawdy songs could land you in court. And in 17th century Puritan England, again slightly post-medieval but worth noting, Christmas celebrations were literally banned. Because what is joy if not a legal offense? And even animals weren't safe from fun bans. In France, one medieval law allowed for the prosecution of noisy frogs. Yes, frogs. Peasants complained about croaking keeping them up at night, and courts took it seriously enough to summon frogs to stop their noise. As you can imagine, compliance rates were low. And yet, modern echoes remain. Noise complaints, zoning laws, public order acts, they all descend from this long tradition of humans trying and failing to legislate against joy and sound. The king who banned death. One of the most famous oddball laws, though it comes later in Renaissance Spain and France, is the occasional ban on death. Yes, some rulers literally declared it illegal to die in certain places. For example, in the town of Le-Lavandou in France, a 20th century mayor passed a law forbidding residents from dying within city limits, as a protest against the lack of cemetery space. But this stunt had medieval roots. Rulers in Spain and later England had issued similar bans tied to church burial grounds. The idea was less about immortality and more about bureaucratic mess. Still, though, the legal absurdity stands. You could break the law just by ceasing to live, which is probably the one crime where nobody can attend their own trial. drifting toward the edge of medieval madness. So what do we have in this middle section? Pigs on trial, bakers in pillories, velvet anxious kings, red-hot iron ordeals.
Hey again. Still here? Still breathing softly in your dimly lit room? Good, because we're gliding into the early modern era now, the 16th through 18th centuries, the time when powdered wigs were considered both fashionable and sanitary. Kings still believed in divine right, and lawmakers really leaned into their favorite hobby, taxing things nobody expected. This was the era of weird little revenue schemes, moral crackdowns, and colonial logic that makes you want to close your eyes and sigh. Let's wander through it slowly, like ghosts sneaking down a creaky hallway lined with legal nonsense. The window tax, because fresh air is luxury. We begin in England, 1696. The government, in desperate need of money, invents the window tax. It worked exactly as it sounds. The more windows your house had, the more you paid in taxes, which was sort of true, but predictably, people responded by bricking up their windows to avoid the tax. If you wander around old English towns today, you'll still see bricked-over windows, like scars of 17th century tax avoidance. Whole families lived in stuffy darkness, sacrificing daylight and ventilation just to save a few coins, which is wonderfully ironic since later reformers would call it a tax on health. And the echoes? Today's property taxes, tied to square footage and amenities, are direct descendants of this logic. If you've ever muttered about paying extra because you have a second bathroom, congratulations, you're reenacting the window tax debate. Wigs, powder, and legal haircuts. While windows were being taxed, heads were being legislated. Wigs, the great symbols of early modern fashion, weren't just ridiculous, they were taxable. In England, a wig tax was introduced in the 1700s. Not just the wig itself, but also the powder you sprinkled into it. Powdered wigs became so associated with wealth and status that the government decided they were fair game for revenue. Which was sort of true, but predictably, people responded by bricking up their windows to avoid the tax. If you wander around old English towns today, you'll still see bricked-over windows, like scars of 17th century tax avoidance. Whole families lived in stuffy darkness, sacrificing daylight and ventilation just to save a few coins, which is wonderfully ironic since later reformers would call it a tax on health. And the echoes? Today's property taxes tied to square footage and amenities are direct descendants of this logic. If you've ever muttered about paying extra because you have a second bathroom, congratulations, you're reenacting the window tax debate. While windows were being taxed, heads were being legislated. Wigs, the great symbols of early modern fashion, weren't just ridiculous, they were taxable. In England, a wig tax was introduced in the 1700s. Not just the wig itself, but also the powder you sprinkled into it. Powdered wigs became so associated with wealth and status that the government decided they were fair game for revenue. Which was sort of true, but predictably, people responded by bricking up their windows to avoid the tax. If you wander around old English towns today, you'll still see bricked-over windows, like scars of 17th century tax avoidance. Whole families lived in stuffy darkness, sacrificing daylight and ventilation just to save a few coins. Which is wonderfully ironic, since later reformers would call it a tax on health. While windows were being taxed, heads were being legislated.
Wigs, the great symbols of early modern fashion, weren't just ridiculous, they were taxable. In England, a wig tax was introduced in the 1700s. Not just the wig itself, but also the powder you sprinkled into it. Powdered wigs became so associated with wealth and status that the government decided they were fair game for revenue. Which was sort of true, but predictably, people responded by bricking up their windows to avoid the tax. If you wander around Old English towns today, you'll still see bricked-over windows, like scars of 17th century tax avoidance. Whole families lived in stuffy darkness, sacrificing daylight and ventilation just to save a few coins, which is wonderfully ironic, since later reformers would call it a tax on health. And the echoes? Today's property taxes, tied to square footage and amenities, are direct descendants of this logic. If you've ever muttered about paying extra because you have a second bathroom, congratulations, you're reenacting the window tax debate. And the wigs are the key. The taxing of wigs was a symbol of the government attempting to control the appearance of the wealthy and elite, which was a common theme in 17th century laws.
Part 4. Industrial and Modern Laws, Trains, Toilets, and Toothpaste Crimes. Hey again. We've survived ancient tablets, medieval pig trials, and early modern window taxes. Now we're stepping into the soot-stained, steam-powered corridors of the 19th and 20th centuries. The Industrial Age, the time when trains shrieked through landscapes, cities filled with smog, and lawmakers scrambled to keep up with inventions they barely understood. Of course, this didn't stop them from writing laws about everything from bathroom etiquette to chewing gum. And just like in Babylon or medieval France, most of these laws were oddly specific, suspiciously personal, and occasionally still with us today. So, let's stroll slowly through the factory doors, hear the hiss of the steam pipes, and explore some of the weirdest modern laws humans came up with while pretending to be advanced. Train laws. Too fast for the human soul. When railways first appeared in the early 19th century, people weren't quite sure how to feel about them. Doctors worried the human body wasn't designed to move faster than 20 miles per hour. Priests feared trains would rip open the sky and offend God. And lawmakers? They panicked and legislated. Britain passed the Locomotive Act of 1865, also known as the Red Flag Law. It required every self-propelled vehicle on public roads to be preceded by a man walking at least 60 yards ahead, carrying a red flag or lantern. That's right, a law designed to make sure trains, and later cars, never moved faster than a brisk jog. Imagine inventing the steam engine, only to have the government say, "Congrats, now hire Steve to walk in front of it forever." The law was repealed decades later, but its spirit lives on in modern road safety regulations. Speed limits, warning signs, and licensing are all descendants of that original panic. Every time you curse at a speed bump, you're spiritually following the man with the red flag. Toilet laws. Pay to pee. Public sanitation became a big legal obsession in the 19th century. Cities were growing fast, and human waste was piling up even faster. Enter the public pay toilet. In 1850s Paris, authorities introduced coin-operated toilets as a way to fund sanitation systems. The idea spread across Europe. Soon, it was legally required in many places. If you wanted to relieve yourself in public facilities, you had to pay a fee. This gave us the phrase to spend a penny, because that's literally what it cost. A penny for your dignity. Women often had to pay more, which tells you everything you need to know about gender and bathrooms. Paid toilets survived well into the 20th century, and while many countries eventually banned them as discriminatory, you can still find versions today in airports, train stations, and some cities. So yes, the long arm of the law has always been reaching into your pocket right as you reach for the stall door.
the battle against chewing gum. Now let's float east to Singapore, 1992. The city-state, famous for its strict cleanliness laws, decided to outlaw chewing gum. Yes, importing or selling chewing gum became illegal, with only rare exceptions for medical gum like nicotine patches. The reason? People were sticking gum on public transport doors, jamming them, and costing the government millions in repairs. The law was enforced with heavy fines. Tourists were warned. Locals grumbled. And yet Singapore stayed gum-free for decades. In 2004, the ban was relaxed slightly, but only for medicinal purposes. It sounds extreme, but it's really just the modern version of bread laws or wig taxes. Governments reacting to specific annoyances with sweeping rules. Next time you step in gum on a sidewalk, you might secretly wish your city had a Singapore-style crackdown too. The bans on reincarnation. This one feels like satire, but it isn't. In 2007, the Chinese government issued regulations declaring that Buddhist monks must obtain official government permission before reincarnating. Yes, you heard that correctly. Legal permission for reincarnation. The law was aimed at controlling the succession of Tibetan spiritual leaders, particularly the Dalai Lama. By requiring state approval, the government ensured it could influence or outright control future religious authority. It's hard to imagine a stranger collision between spiritual belief and bureaucracy. Imagine a divine soul filling out paperwork at a government office, waiting in line with a little numbered ticket. And yet the law still exists. Proof that no matter how modern we get, someone, somewhere, will write down rules that defy reason. The Great Hat Panic. Industrial society was also obsessed with hats. In Victorian England, hats were more than fashion. They were identity. And of course, that meant legal attention. London had laws requiring cab drivers to carry a bale of hay in their carriages for the horses. This law technically remained on the books well into the 20th century. But one lesser-known side note, drivers were also required to wear specific hats, part of their licensed uniform. Forget your hat, forget your fare. And in America, hat taxes appeared sporadically. In New York, early 19th century lawmakers tried taxing beaver hats to raise revenue, which sounds like parody, but was very real. Today, uniforms, safety helmets, and dress codes are all legal descendants of the great hat obsession. Somewhere deep down, lawmakers never stop caring about what's on your head. Bicycle laws. Keep it polite. When bicycles spread in the late 19th century, authorities weren't sure how to regulate them. Cue strange laws. In some American towns, cyclists had to carry bells, lanterns, and sometimes licenses. One city in Illinois required cyclists to have a license plate on their bike, complete with registration fees. And in London, cyclists were banned from riding furiously. That's the actual word used, no furious cycling. Which is a pity, because furious cycling sounds like an Olympic sport we deserve. Today, bike regulations are more standardized, but the echoes remain. Every helmet law, every bike lane rule, every don't cycle on sidewalks ordinance is a quiet echo of the first panic over men in bloomers speeding down cobblestones. Toothpaste crimes and hygiene panic. Industrial cities had hygiene problems, and lawmakers tried to solve them with weird precision. In early 20th century America, several cities passed laws banning the sale of adulterated toothpaste. Apparently, some toothpaste contained chalk, brick dust, or even mercury. So yes, the law had to step in and say, stop selling poison for teeth. Meanwhile, in Britain, spitting in public became illegal in many towns, partly due to tuberculosis fears. Police patrolled for spitters, public signs warned against it. The echoes survive today in no spitting signs on buses and trains. It's almost comforting. Humanity went from banning pig crimes to banning spitting. Progress of a sort. The final law, the don't be ugly laws.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, several American cities passed so-called ugly laws. These ordinances prohibited people with unsightly or disgusting appearances from appearing in public. They targeted the disabled, the poor, and the homeless. The first appeared in Chicago in 1881. Variants spread to other cities, lasting well into the mid-20th century. It's one of the darkest examples of how law can reflect cruelty and prejudice. The echoes survive today in more subtle forms: zoning laws that push the homeless out of sight, or ordinances that criminalize poverty. The spirit of the ugly law never fully vanished. Drifting into the present. So what did we gather in this smoky, industrial wander? Trains preceded by red flags to keep human souls safe from speed. Public toilets monetized for every penny you carried. Chewing gum bans saving subway doors from sticky doom. Modern bans on death and paperwork for reincarnation. Hat taxes, wig taxes' modern cousin. Bicycle, no furious riding laws. Toothpaste crimes and spitting patrols. Ugly laws where cruelty masqueraded as civic order. Each law tells us something about its age, the fears, the obsessions, and the small human irritations that spiraled into legal code. And yes, the echoes remain. Modern bureaucracy, public health codes, and even strange bans on food or dress, they're all part of this long tradition of humans making rules about things they don't really understand. But we're almost at the end. In the next part, we'll slide gently into the 21st century, where the internet, social media, and global weirdness have produced laws about memes, baby names, and even space. Yes, space has laws now. For now, let the red flag walkers and gum inspectors drift into your half-dreams like silent guardians of absurdity. They've done their job for centuries.
Part 5. Modern and 21st Century Weird Laws. Memes, baby names, and space. Hey, we've made it this far. Through clay tablets, bricked-up windows, powdered wigs, pigs on trial, and pay toilets, we've traveled more than 3 millennia of human attempts to legislate everything from morality to mortality. Now let's drift gently into the modern era, the 20th and 21st centuries, where technology, global connectivity, and human creativity have created new opportunities for lawmakers to overreach, misunderstand, or just get bored and make arbitrary rules. Baby names, because you can't call your kid 123. In many countries today, parents can't name their children whatever they like. This sounds bureaucratic, but the logic, sometimes practical, sometimes absurd, varies. In Sweden, for example, parents cannot choose a name that might cause discomfort or offense. That means no Superman or IKEA. And yes, you can be sure someone once tried. The authorities review names to ensure they meet civilized standards. In Germany, names must indicate gender clearly, so naming your child Monkey Face is not allowed, not even if you really love monkeys. In Iceland, it takes it further. The country maintains an official list of approved names. Any new name must be linguistically compatible with Icelandic grammar. Attempt to submit XAIE 12, and you'll face a polite but firm denial. It's modern, reasonable on the surface, but still deeply weird. Somewhere, someone is arguing with a government office over their desire to name a child something perfectly sensible to them, but completely nonsensible to the law. Meme laws and internet weirdness. Speaking of senseless, the internet has produced its own legal headaches. Memes, GIFs, TikToks, things that humans thought were funny, have occasionally violated copyright, defamation, or anti-hate laws. In Germany, there are strict meme laws regarding depictions of Nazis. Posting a Hitler joke can technically be illegal, even if it's satirical. France similarly has anti-hate speech laws that apply to online memes. Meanwhile, in the US, courts are still figuring out the boundaries of parody, fair use, and deep fake humor. And yes, the logic can be painfully absurd. Imagine a teenager in their bedroom, innocently posting a cat photo with a poorly chosen caption, suddenly entangled in a legal gray area shaped by centuries of convoluted copyright and social norms. It's almost medieval in a way. Laws designed by distant authorities trying to anticipate behavior they barely understand. Except now, instead of pigs, it's teenagers and memes. Drone laws, because the sky belongs to everyone. Drones became popular in the 2010s. Suddenly, hobbyists were flying cameras over parks, weddings, and occasionally private backyards. Governments panicked. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, in the US, and similar agencies worldwide imposed strict regulations. You must register drones over a certain weight, maintain line of sight, avoid airports, and never annoy your neighbors. Some cities introduced extra laws: no flying over public events, schools, or prisons. In Switzerland, drones were required to be painted with their operator's name. Imagine being forced to sign your name on a tiny flying robot, forever linking your legal identity to a buzzing sky menace. And naturally, some laws are so recent that only early adopters understand the penalties. Drones are the new pigs on trial, except now they capture aerial selfies instead of causing fatal accidents. Space laws. Seriously, space. Yes, space. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 declares that no nation may claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, which sounds like common sense. But from there, it gets weirder. Satellites must avoid harmful contamination. Countries are responsible for any space debris their spacecraft create. Weapons of mass destruction are prohibited in orbit. Basically, if Elon Musk sends a starship to Mars and accidentally drops a Tesla into orbit, someone, somewhere, is legally responsible. And national laws have popped up too. Luxembourg, for example, allows companies to own resources they mine on asteroids. So, yes, there's now a legal framework for extraterrestrial mining, with property rights, contracts, and potential disputes. It's the modern equivalent of colonial land laws, but in zero gravity, with much higher stakes and more complicated insurance. And it reminds us that humanity will always try to extend its legal obsession into every frontier, terrestrial or otherwise. Extremely local laws, tiny town tyrannies. Even on Earth, some laws are charmingly or maddeningly specific. These survive in modern cities and towns like legal fossils. A few favorites. In Quitman, Georgia, it's illegal to carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket on Sundays. The origin is murky, but most historians speculate it had something to do with horse theft. Horses were allegedly lured away by ice cream cones. In Samoa, it is illegal to forget your wife's birthday. Enforcement? Probably ceremonial at best, but still, written law exists. In Switzerland, it's illegal to flush toilets after 10 p.m. in apartments to avoid disturbing neighbors. That's right, your bodily needs are officially time-regulated. These laws are mostly symbolic, but they reveal the human desire to regulate behavior down to the smallest, most personal details. Animal laws continue. Even in modern times, animals occasionally get legal attention, but now it's less about executions and more about control and welfare. In France, you cannot name a pig Napoleon. This is technically a law, though rarely enforced. In Australia, some states regulate the ownership of exotic animals, including rabbits, ferrets, and parrots, because humans can be surprisingly bad at judging which pets might overrun the ecosystem. Animals are still legal subjects, in a way, and humanity's old obsession with control continues, though thankfully without the pig trials and public burnings. Public nuisances, from fountains to frowns. Modern nuisance laws echo medieval anxieties in subtle ways. In New York City, it's illegal to honk your horn unnecessarily. In Portugal, you cannot urinate in the ocean. Technically, enforcement is tricky. In some U.S. cities, singing loudly or playing loud music during prohibited hours is punishable. These laws are essentially keep society peaceful, but their specificity can be charming or oppressive, depending on how you feel about noisy neighbors at 2 a.m. Gently floating back to perspective. So, in the modern era, what have we learned? Laws still regulate mundane behaviors, like bodily functions and pets. Technology, from drones to space rockets, produces entirely new legal territories. Humor, fashion, and names remain legal frontiers. Humanity continues its long tradition of over-legislating minor annoyances, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. In short, humans never outgrow the urge to control small things, punish eccentricities, and create rules that future generations will read with disbelief. It's the same impulse from Hammurabi to Tsar Peter to modern municipal councils. Floating into the end. As we slowly drift toward the end of this very long journey through history's weirdest laws, it's worth reflecting on the pattern. Laws are as much about fear and inconvenience as they are about justice. The specifics are often strange, trivial, or deeply personal. Yet they survive in some form, quietly influencing our behavior thousands of years later. So as you lie back, letting your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the red flag walkers from the 1800s, the bricked-up windows of 17th century England, the powdered wig wearers, the pig defendants, and yes, even the modern parents filling out paperwork to legally name their child. All of them are echoes in a long, strange legal lineage, reminders that humans have always tried and always failed to legislate the absurdities of life. And somewhere, perhaps, someone is drafting the next bizarre law right now. Maybe about virtual reality, AI pets, or drones delivering pizza. And in 300 years, some sleepy historian will be reading it aloud in exactly this tone, while you drift even deeper into dreams. Good night.